They're not racist, they're not sick, they're not guilty of the crime that plagues the land. They are black and they are white, Nixon said. They work in the factories, they run the businesses, they give lift to the American dream. They work, they save, they pay their taxes, and they care. Nixon was speaking in the allegedly classless language of conservative populism, which Professor Kazin has written so well about. And he was seeking to put blue-collar union workers and their white-collar managers in the same political coalition. It's the Republican fantasy, and Thomas Frank thinks that they've succeeded in doing that. I'm not so sure. Nixon deployed explicitly moral terms to define the forgotten Americans as hardworking taxpayers, contrasted, of course, with the troublemaking minority who spend their time shouting and demonstrating, which would be civil rights activists in the anti-war movement. And by defending the forgotten Americans with his moral labels, they're not racist, they're not guilty, Nixon was, in fact, implicitly repudiating the Kerner Commission report, saying that white society and white institutions were to blame for the urban crisis and the race riots. This forgotten Americans label, soon to be reincarnated with the even more resonant silent majority label, managed to evoke the turmoil of the polarized 1960s and the placid suburban rights activists in the anti-war. A prominent historian of conservatism has written that, quote, Nixon's Southern strategy courted the same white backlash voters that gave Dixie to Goldwater by huge margins. Even though Goldwater and Nixon did not even win the same Southern states. The best political biography of George Wallace argues that Nixon and subsequent Republicans recoded the platform of the segregationist Alabama governor. Even though Nixon and Reagan both honed their political platforms in the racially segregated suburbs of Southern California in the 1950s and 1960s. One of my favorite scholars of public policy has repeatedly written that of the suburban backlash against housing integration, the Southern strategy had an important northern flank. So the South leads the way racially, and the rest of the nation is kind of lagging behind. Last Sunday, the New York Times tried to provide some historical context for Obama's race speech by explaining that, quote, the Republicans studied the campaigns of George Wallace, and then they developed a Southern strategy that helped Richard Nixon and later Ronald Reagan. And in Paul Krugman's constantly reiterated formulation, the decline of neoliberalism and the rise of new right conservatism can be condensed to 5 simple words. Southern whites started voting Republican. It's a, quote, almost embarrassingly simple story, Krugman explains. Republicans exploited the race issue to win political dominance of the South. End of story. If an explanation seems embarrassingly simple, capable of being turned into a one-liner on cable news, it's probably wrong.